Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Stanford Graduate School of Education's annual Cubberley Lecture. I am Dan Schwartz, Dean of the school. So I'd like to start by noting that despite being remote, we've been finalizing plans for an inviting new campus for the School of Education. The campus will greatly increase our abilities to engage the community and the rest of the university. And in this context of the changing of the land, it's fitting to recognize that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people, and consistent with our values of community inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. So I have to say, I miss the energy of filling the big auditorium. This event draws in very many people, but just in case you can't tell, there is energy in the room. More than 1,200 people, alumni, students, faculty, educators, friends, and parents have registered for tonight's program. Since 1938, the Cubberley Lecture has had the explicit purpose of creating a public forum for elevating issues of critical importance in education. And it is beautiful that so many people are taking the time to think and learn together. Our community is inspired by tonight's distinguished speakers and the relentlessly pressing role of education and democracy. So our goal is to challenge your thinking tonight and that you emerge with new tools for understanding the world around us. This is hard work. This is what a university should do. Susan Rivera, the president of Macalester College, and Gabriel Starr, president of Pomona College, captured the idea of the university's role in a recent Inside Higher Education opinion piece. They said, as the world watches the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, students on college campuses across the country are trying to make meaning. It is what we do. Our highest calling may be to use all the knowledge, skills, and tools we have at hand to make sense of the world in which we live. So here is the evening's menu. Our keynote speaker, Gloria Ladson-Billings, will share a presentation for about 20 minutes. Then GSE faculty Guadalupe Valdes, Tom Ehrlich, and Antero Garcia will join Gloria for a conversation moderated by Guadalupe. After that, we will open the floor to Q&A. So I invite you to pose your questions using the Q&A feature in your Zoom webinar toolbar. Please try to do your best to be succinct so we can engage as many voices as possible in the conversation. And be sure to check out the chat for other useful event notes. My job this evening is much like a host at a fancy restaurant. I'm helping you appreciate the atmosphere. I'm showing you to your table. And now I let you know about the specials of the night, and they are very special. First, we have Gloria Ladson-Billings. She is both a preeminent scholar and a fabulously thoughtful activist. She's internationally recognized for advancing our understanding of the obstacles confronting students of color. She was the president of the American Educational Research Association, which is the main professional organization for scholars of education. She is Professor Emerita at the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Wisconsin. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she is the current president of the National Academy of Education. And so I look forward to when Gloria really retires. Actually, I don't look forward to it. I don't want it to happen. So Gloria is also our own. She received her doctorate at Stanford Graduate School of Education, and for that, we are especially proud. Gloria foresaw the fundamental question of education, democracy, and equality 37 years ago. She's very true of purpose. Here's her dissertation title, which of course included a colon. And the title went, Citizenship and Values, colon, an ethnographic study of citizenship and values in a Black school setting. Gloria, you bring enduring brilliance and relevance. Our moderator for tonight, who is also very special, is Guadalupe Valdes. She specializes in language teaching and applied linguistics. Her scholarship focuses on English-Spanish bilingualism of Latinos in the United States. It saddens me to say that Guadalupe is retiring this year. We will miss her wisdom greatly. At the same time, it's important to know She's been a singular force in helping us to hire the finest and most relevant faculty. So in this way, Guadalupe's legacy will last several generations. So thank you, Guadalupe. So Gloria and Guadalupe, if those two aren't enough, will be joined by Tom Ehrlich. So Tom previously served as president of Indiana University, provost of the University of Pennsylvania, dean of the Stanford Law School. And if that isn't enough, he served in the federal government during the administrations of 6 presidents. So can you imagine that? So the GSE is deeply honored that he has thrown in his lot with us. So thank you, Tom. And finally, Professor Antero Garcia, who brings all the flavor to the table. Antero has brought a fundamentally new approach to understanding and cultivating children's civic identities. He goes beyond stuffy presentations on the branches of government. It starts with the potential civic engagement and issues available to children and how to help them experience that they can make a difference. He began his career as an English teacher at a public high school in South Central Los Angeles. Personally, I have always wanted to make a website called Ask Antero. And if you have a question about how to engage students in questions of democracy, he has ideas. So thank you all very much. Thank you all for attending. I hope you enjoy a very interesting and demanding evening. Gloria, I turn it to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. What a lovely introduction. I think I'd eat at your restaurant at any time. So I've titled this A Republic If You Can Keep It, the democratic work of education. And following Dan's lead, I am in Madison, Wisconsin. And so it is important that I also make a land acknowledgement because the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies the ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejup since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory, and decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. And today, the University of Wisconsin-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. I also want to make sure that I acknowledge that the education research community has lost a giant. Over the weekend, we lost Robert Slavin. Bob Slavin is known for his work most recently as this notion of success for all, this idea that you could accelerate kids and that you could ensure that all kids, regardless of their circumstances, could learn to read and to read well. And so we will deeply miss not having Bob. I will miss him as president of the National Academy because he's one of our Academy members, but I will certainly miss his twinkling eyes and his good nature. Fortunately, we have his scholarship with us forever. So I won't spend any time here. Dan did a great job of introducing me, but I will tell you just a little bit about where I'm from, because I think sometimes when you know where someone's from, you get a perspective. So you see 4 pictures here. Top left-hand picture is the skyline of Philadelphia. I was born and raised there. The birthplace of liberty, we call ourselves. But I also was a teacher in the Philadelphia Public Schools. So I taught social studies and US government while being a teacher there for 10 years. The picture right next to it is a picture of my undergraduate institution, which is Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. And sometimes I ask people to try to guess who that statue is, but I won't have you do it this time. But that's Frederick Douglass. Just like there are iconic places on the Stanford campus where you might tell somebody to meet you at the Memorial Fountain, on this campus, you'd say, meet me at Fred. The picture underneath the Philadelphia picture is a picture I like to tease my Seattle friends with. It is on the campus of the University of Washington. It's called The Mountain and the Fountain. So if you are in Red Square looking out, you see the fountain, but I will tell you it's only about 5 days out of a year that you see that mountain back there in the horizon, which is Mount Rainier. And then of course, you all know that this final picture is a picture looking west on Palm Drive at Stanford. And so these are all 4 places that really shaped who I am and how I think about any number of things. called this presentation A Republic If You Can Keep It, because it starts with Benjamin Franklin. Now, I told you I was from Philadelphia, and if you spend any time in Philadelphia, everything is named Franklin. There's the Franklin Parkway, there's the Franklin Institute. You go over to Jersey on the Benjamin Franklin Bridge. We love Benjamin Franklin. But what happened, allegedly, is that in 1787, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, Franklin is coming out of Independence Hall. And a woman by the name of Elizabeth Soule asked him, "What have you given us, Mr. Franklin? A monarchy or a republic?" And Franklin's response is, "A republic, if you can keep it." And that becomes really the sort of driving force as I thought about this presentation. The republic, if we can keep it. And one of the places we hope to keep it, of course, is in our schools. You see here two examples of what the Constitution allows: freedom of assembly, a right to petition the government. On the left, people are doing what the Bill of Rights says they can do. They may have a freedom of assembly. They may come together. On the right, they are also permitted to come together, and they are allowed to petition the government, but they cannot interfere with the lawful transition of a government. They cannot unlawfully trespass into a federal building. So we begin to talk about, well, what does it mean to be a part of a republic? And which vision do we share in classrooms? So you've got two images there, the 1619 Project, which was published by the New York Times in 2019 as a commemoration of the 400 years that Black people had come to the US shores. Of course, it wasn't the US at that time, but it had come to the Americas. And then the 1776 report. And you may know less about the 1776 report, but it was an advisory commission that was established in 2020, September, by then President Donald Trump in support of what was called patriotic education. Although it included no historian specializing in US history, it was released on January 18th, 2 days before the end of his term. What I think is interesting is that the goals of this particular project were, and I'd like to quote it, to end what the president called a radicalized view of American history, which had, quote, vilified the United States founders and its foundings. In response to the work of figures like Howard Zinn and groups like the 1619 Project, which are specifically named, this 1776 commission seeks to increase patriotic education via a centralized approach to nationalist curriculum. It was also intended to promote these concepts at places like national parks, landmarks, and monuments, among other federal properties. So it's interesting that these two very differing views of who we are as a nation. Now, some people will say, well, which one are we supposed to use if we are teachers? What vision do we share in the classroom? I will tell you that the smart teacher will share them both with students and have students compare and contrast. They will have students do the work that it takes to make sense of these documents, to come to their own perspective and their own ideas with enough evidence to say, okay, this makes sense to me, or I have questions about this. We often ask the question what schools are supposed to do, and some folks think, well, what they're supposed to do is reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's just get those basic skills down. Others think that, well, schools are a place to get you trained vocationally, get you prepared for the world of work. But the third perspective, and one that I will tell you that I share, is really about schools as a place to develop Democrats, small d, to develop citizens. And it's not a new idea. In fact, John Dewey had insisted that the central ethical purpose of education is democracy. Unfortunately, many of Dewey's ideas were rejected by the time we got to the Cold War, because we became much more enamored of having a, quote, scientific, technical education. So if we do choose democratic citizenship, then what do we mean by that? Are we talking about compliance, that people show up on the first Tuesday in November, 4 times every 4 years, or whenever voting is available? Or are they actively engaged in civic change, which means that we have to look at our individual values, our group values, and our social values? I want to switch now and remind you that I think we're in the midst of 4 pandemics. Now, some people are going, 4, we've got our hands full with one. Well, yes, this one is occupying a lot of our time, the novel coronavirus. I don't have to tell you about it. You know that that's the reason we're having this Cubberley Lecture like we're having, and I'm not enjoying the beautiful spring of Palo Alto. I'm still in Wisconsin. But it's not the only pandemic. We also have a pandemic of systemic racism. And someone might say, well, that's a very US thing. It's not pandemic. Pandemic means it's around the world. Well, can I tell you that when this incident happened with Mr. Floyd, I didn't just hear from people across the US. I got calls and emails and texts from colleagues and friends in the UK who said, we have this same situation. From France, who said, yeah, we have this same situation. From Canada, who said, yeah, we deal with this too. From New Zealand. So yes, this notion of systemic racism is one that has traversed the globe. But there are some other pandemics we're dealing with. We're dealing with what will invariably be an economic collapse. I know that the government is working hard to try to shore up some things. We've had the CARES Act passed, but the truth of the matter is that there are any number of people who are awaiting eviction from apartments or who are awaiting foreclosure from homes. Something like 2.2 million women left the workforce in the midst of this pandemic, so much so that economists call it a she-cession instead of a recession. And then the fourth one is one that those of you who are in California are quite familiar with, and that is environmental catastrophe. It's not a hoax. It's something that is likely that we are on the precipice of. So our students and young people are dealing with all 4 of these things. And it sounds like a lot of gloom and doom, but I want to take a cue from the Indian novelist Arundhati Roy, who suggests that historically pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And we can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or, and that's the critical word here, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So it is this other world that I think we have to focus on. But the question becomes, how far do we need to come? So I'm going to share with you a brief video that addresses this question of systemic racism.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
A very quick encapsulation of how we got here. But I asked the question, the more pragmatic question, is teaching civics the same as learning civics? So one of the things that I think we have to understand is that any number of scholars and researchers are looking at this question. On the left, you see the book, The Political Classroom by Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy, which won the Grummeyer Award a couple years ago. They asked questions of teachers in classrooms and observed in classrooms where they saw a kind of dividing line among groups of students. For example, a teacher might pass out an article that was written in the New York Times and have a student say, "We don't read the New York Times in my house." So you could not even get into the discussion. One of the hopeful anecdotes to this is a new publication that was just published by the National Academy of Education. This is a shameless plug, called Educating for Civic Reasoning and Discourse. And what we tried to do in this particular volume, which was supported by the Hewlett Foundation, is to begin to help teachers and community members understand that we have to have a way to see the other side. We have to have a way to be able to have a conversation with people that we don't agree with. We have to be able to provide what the founders originally wanted for us. The sense of a republic requires us to sit sometimes with very uncomfortable information. I ask, given that we're gone through this COVID-19 pandemic, can we actually have a new world of schooling? Because if we go back to normal, remember my point about Arundhati Roy's quote about getting through that portal in a new world. But if we go back to what we think of as normal, does that mean that we have continued inequities like we saw in that little video? Are we continuing to promote a deficit perspective about students? Do we believe that we actually can move students ahead by remediation, that is by slowing them down? But what if we move from a 19th century curriculum to a 21st century one? What if we helped our students focus on things like problem solving? So for example, we might ask the question, what does it mean? Or what does migration mean for species? Big question. It's a question that could be answered in the sciences, looking at genetic variation and adaptation and pandemics and vaccines and taxonomies like that proposed by Linnaeus, or environmental impact. In math, it might mean predicting population growth, or what does dispersal look like, or how do we estimate certain things? You know, for example, we've gone from two people with COVID in February of 2020 to just millions of people. That will help kids begin to understand what we mean by exponential growth. In history and social studies, of course, we can look at great migrations from Europe to the US, from the South to the North and to the West, reading books like Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. What about the internal migration? That is things like urban renewal, where people move from one part of a city to another, or gentrification, or the constructing and crossing of geopolitical borders. In English, there's all kinds of books we might read, such as The Grapes of Wrath or My Antonio. You will notice that these are sort of classics, right? Not suggesting we throw them out. I'm saying we employ them and use them to answer big questions. A Brown Girls, Brown Stones by Jackie Woodson, or The Late Homecomer that tells the story of a Cambodian immigrant, or The Tortilla Curtain. Of course, music and art could provide us other outlets. I want to end by sharing an example of what this more problems-based approach might look like.
Neighborhoods are ovens with windows. And as the knob on global warming increases, lives are preheated until a soul souffles. Pancake stack projects are poured over with a humid as thick as molasses. Heat and humidity are the perfect appetizer on death's plate. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet from May to October, and senior citizen discount is every day. If thermometers can measure temperatures, they should be able to measure human anxiety. As the temperature rises, we reach boiling points. Attitudes of those around us rise quicker than mercury, and the pressure of staying cool causes us to explode. Compressed living complexes circulate heat and cause compressed feelings to converge upon our neighbors in the hood. So that 90% release of excess body heat talked about in science class is contributed to our local temperature rising. We crack open fire hydrants until we hear lights crying, raising taxes by lowering our body temperature. And if you couldn't afford a wind replacer, fridges and freezers were propped open until your two brothers' faces are frozen. Audiences applaud the ice cream man once that familiar jingle mingles with our ears. This sweet release of flooded heat is a godsend. But what do you know? The ice cream vendor's name is Noah. As the temperature rises, so do attitudes, death rates, bills, and ice cream stocks. Heat affects the elderly more than it does us. Their lungs resemble the Dow Exchange, rises and drops until they crash. Ambulances are summoned, riding down the street flooded with the contents of the only fire hydrant. And we have only just begun to fry.
So what you got to witness there is an 18-year-old Elijah Raquan who merged his interests with climate change, spoken word, English, performance, to put together an audition tape in which we actually accepted him at the University of Wisconsin. And he is now a holder of a degree in environmental science, and he's a climate scientist. There are so many important ways that we can begin to teach our young people. And so when they ask the question, what have you left us, Mr. Franklin? Hopefully we can say, a republic, if you can keep it. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Gloria, for a very thought-provoking presentation. I know that our audience and our panelists are going to be very eager to engage with these ideas. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I particularly enjoyed watching the videos that you shared with us. They were stimulating and packed with ideas and raised so many wonderful questions, wonderfully difficult questions. We are, as you say, at a moment where we can choose how we move forward. Yes. So I am eager to hear what Tom and Antero have to say to us. Tom, you've thought a lot about these issues. You've thought a lot about, especially on college campuses, how we engage college students in questions that involve civic engagement, views about democracy. How will you respond to some of the ideas that Gloria shared?
Thanks, Guadalupe, and thank you, Gloria. That was a powerful lecture. It was a 10 strike. As we grapple with systemic racism, you help us imagine the world anew. And one in which we can emphasize the need for education and democracy, and also, as you indicated, the need to be very clear what that means. Yes, the issue isn't new. It was, as you mentioned, dealt with by John Dewey, the great advocate for the precept that democracy can't function without educational systems that prepare students to become engaged citizens, which is what we're seeking. Well before Dewey, Horace Mann helped create the Massachusetts school system, what he called common schools, on the premise that early on, students needed to come from all backgrounds and work together, to interact together and to learn together so they can participate together and listen to the views of others and come to learn from others, just as you underscored. There were classes in civics before World War II, and many of them taught not only about government, but they enabled them to actually experience how government works in their own communities. Sadly, from my perspective, at least after World War II, civics as a discipline dwindled. The rise of political science bears at least part of the blame, I think, because of the insistence that learning about government has to be totally disengaged from participation in government. In higher education, which I know more about than K-12 schools, the sharp rise in community service learning starting in the early 1980s raised the visibility of civic engagement significantly. But those of us who were university administrators at the time, we naively thought that all we had to do was encourage students to volunteer for community service, to help with the problems of their community, cleaning up parks, tutoring kids, serving in community kitchens. We really didn't appreciate that students should also be asking why their communities needed those kitchens, what public policies could do to correct the failings. Well, the next step was to link community service with the curriculum through service learning courses and they have blossomed enormously throughout the country in colleges and universities. But only a handful of those courses have paid real attention to public policies and politics. Fortunately, from my perspective, that's changed in the aftermath of the 2016 election. Now, millions more college students are being prepared to be politically engaged, to grapple with just the kinds of issues, Gloria, that you raised. And in part because of that education, youth voting surged in 2020 as compared to 2016. That's a start. But voters age 18 to 28 is still the lowest voting group in the country. So much more education for democracy is needed. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Thank you very much for those comments. I think that I want to focus on your hopefulness because there's been a lot of change. And I think that as we move to talk to Antero has thought very deeply. And as I look at his work and read him, that's what I always come away with a sense of hope of what we can do in schools for young people, especially minoritized youth. Antero, would you share with us some of your responses to Gloria's presentation?
Yeah, thanks, Guadalupe, and thanks everybody. I don't feel particularly hopeful tonight. I haven't been feeling particularly hopeful in the past 14, almost 15 months of this pandemic, if I'm being perfectly frank. I think, Gloria, I love the vision of a problem-centered education that you offer at the end here. And my biggest challenge, as I think about it, is where do teachers get the capacity to get to do the kind of freedom dreaming that this work necessitates, right? We have almost 600,000 people in the US that have died because of this pandemic, and it is still ongoing. Everybody needs to get vaccinated. And in the midst of all of this, we have waves and generations of grief and healing that's going to need to happen. And so much of what I'm seeing right now is the return to normal from districts, exactly what you're calling for us to resist. And so thinking about how do we step through that portal that Roy speaks of? How do we step through that portal and also do that wholly, make us whole in terms of healing, in terms of making sure that we're feeling complete, as well as reckoning with the other pandemics that you raised? How do we reckon with the very fact that we need to say something as simple as Black Lives Matter and recognize that one verdict by no means brings anything to brings the loss of George Floyd or other people to justice, right? That we have so much more to do. And part of, I think, what we have to do is this idea of coming together as a foundational principle of what happens in schools is tricky. Schools were designed for certain kinds of people historically to come together. Schools, as a part and parcel of the system of US government, is built on a foundation of chattel slavery. And so if we think about who is supposed to come together, it was never about Black people. It was never about Indigenous people. And we need to take these as for granted as part of the steps of what we probably need to do if we're going to step through that portal. I think part of how we do that is recognize the ways that meritocracy, exceptionalism, the nostalgia of wanting to go back to the good old days are a good old days that are largely infused by a vision of whiteness that's shaped, I think, what we think of as a pastoral America. Part of the ways that we resist this is recognizing also that the events of January 6th are a kind of civic imagination, right? As violent, as difficult as they are for us to continue to think about how we're going to talk about these in schools, one way we should talk about them is the kinds of activism that we expect young people to engage in on the side of justice is precisely what happened on that day. It just happened in the name of white supremacy. And that's a pretty painful and difficult thing for us to reconcile with. And so I want to name that as one thing. Gloria, one thing I've been really struck by as I was listening to your words and being inspired by your work today was the title of your book, which I think is just over 25 years old, The Dream Keepers, which I think specifically speaks to and calls to the work of teachers of Black students and of all students, right? And I think, you know, what does it mean to be a dream keeper in 2021? What's it mean to be a dream keeper as we exit the pandemic? Feels like the kind of call of a question that I'm excited about thinking about with all of you.
So Gloria, do you want to comment on both of what Tom and Antero said?
Just briefly, I want to, first of all, thank you for your patience with me and my sparse slides that I sent you. But I also want to just say that, I think both Tom and Antero represent important viewpoints that we've got to wrestle with. That can we continue to have a kind of engagement and activism in the current structures that we have when we think of university campus? And I'm on one of the most, quote, activist campuses in the country, at least that's what they call it. My students are always out there, but are they changing, and are they thinking, and are they engaging in new ideas? And I think one of the things that runs interference, that keeps our students from growing in the way we'd like to see them grow, is the technologies that we now use create algorithms that tell us what we ought to be thinking. So even if I wanted to read something that was radically different from my perspective, I have to search for it. It's not going to just show up on a timeline for me, because whoever puts these algorithms together decided she likes these people, she cares about these issues, she wants to engage with these ideas. And I'm not sure our students have been able to break out of that. Antero, the reason that I can maintain this hope is because of the trajectory of chattel slavery. I am 4 generations away from it. I literally had grandparents who were sharecroppers and great-grandparents who were enslaved. So for me to be a, quote, endowed chair, there suggests that there is a movement. And I, quite frankly, if I were back teaching government or US history even in a K-12 setting in a high school, I would probably not start with the age of exploration, the way the textbook says. I would probably start with someone like Fannie Lou Hamer and ask the question, does democracy work for someone like this? To really have kids kind of dig, because see, George Washington didn't actually need democracy. George was landed gentry. He could have pretty much what he wanted. Democracy is always for the underclass. And so once I think we can get our students to understand how democracy works and why it works, then I think we have that piece of hope. And then young people like Elijah, who I've had the pleasure of teaching, keep that hope springing alive for me. So I really, again, I appreciate both of you taking the time to try to make sense of my ramblings here.
Well, thank you, Gloria. So Tom, now I want to take you back to college campuses, because they've been under attack lately, right? There's a way of thinking that somehow we're engaged in these nefarious deeds, and we're all totally liberal, and that kids don't, if they're conservative, they can't have ways of participating in conversations. So how should universities be a central place to develop these critical thinking skills that we need in our society?
Well, there's no magic bullet. And let me just say, I totally agree with Gloria's point of, I do have hope with you. We have moved from a country founded by a small group of wealthy white men through movements that brought us abolition, movements that brought us women's suffrage, movements that brought us civil rights. We've got a long way to go. But back in college, one of my government professors, Samuel Huntington, said in the end of a book he wrote on American politics, some say American democracy is a failure. It's not a failure, it's a disappointment. But because it's a disappointment, there's also hope. So I do have hope. And I have hope too, because teaching a course on democracy for Stanford graduate and undergraduate students, I see a lot of the same gleam in their eyes that you, Gloria, have, and Antero as well. So I think this generation is going to do important things, some that unfortunately my generation failed. But in terms of Guadalupe's issue in higher education, it does take multiple overlapping, intersecting interventions. Some are curricular. Courses that emphasize modes of active learning, so students not only learn about politics, but they learn in public policies, but they learn to take active part in them. Some are co-curricular. Just to take one example, countless times I've heard a young politician or government official talk to a group of my students, and the students say, that could be me. I could be doing that. And that's a key motivator. So having a faculty or staff mentor to guide students from community service to really engage in the kind of tough issues that you've been raising, Gloria, is enormously important. And it takes those kinds of interventions. For a book I wrote with colleagues called Education for Democracy, we studied 20 different higher education programs and courses from a 2-year program down to single courses. All of them sought to educate students to be politically engaged. The approaches differed in detail, but all of them seemed to us to effectively teach students 3 key interrelated capacities. First, political understanding, the knowledge of current issues and events in historical context, needed to judge the soundness of public policies, to hold representatives accountable. Second, political skills, those skills of analyzing and judging political issues, of assessing the accuracy of news and information, communication, of leadership, and of teamwork and collaboration. And third, maybe the toughest, political motivation. That's the ability to see the relevance of political issues for one's own life, to not think, oh, it can't make a difference what I do. That's the hardest and perhaps the most important. Gaining a sense of efficacy, that a student really can make a difference in just the kinds of issues you've been raising. But we found that those capacities, well taught, well learned, do enable students and motivate students to engage in the kinds of public policies and politics that are their communities, but also our nation much is in need of.
And that's so important. Thank you so much, Tom. Now, I want to move just briefly, because I know we're going to move to the Q&A from our audience, but I want to ask Antero one last question. We mentioned technology. Gloria mentioned technology. And I'd like you, I know you thought a lot about this. So what roles does technology have in engaging younger audiences who may be, especially those who may have been traditionally marginalized in society?
Yeah, thanks, Guadalupe. And I think, Gloria, you brought up the ways algorithms are maybe pernicious or algorithms of oppression, as Sophia Noble might speak to them. And I think this is an important piece for us to think about the role that a bunch of tools from folks here in Stanford's backyard are largely responsible for have shaped democracy, big D democracy in this country is really important for us to recognize. I think one kind of maybe aside I'll briefly say about this is, we're able to have this conversation on Zoom today. And so we are all kind of quote unquote in the cloud, floating billowously above all of you at this very moment. The cloud there is no cloud, right? The cloud is actually a bunch of computer servers that are sitting on somebody's land and are taking up energy, right? So I want to push against the metaphors of how we think about technology and recognize that technology is tied to our ecology and the environment and all of the other kinds of pandemic pieces that we're thinking about. There's labor and markets that are shaping how we're able to have these conversations, right? So for example, we are on Zoom. Zoom is using Amazon's web servers, right? A big part of how Amazon makes its money is through selling web servers, right? And so we're a part of this big conglomeration, right, in terms of what's happening. So I want to recognize that as one piece. I think the other thing, though, is a lot of times when we think about technology, this can be a place for amplification, right? Young people are able to share, and things can go quote unquote viral, and things can get canceled or deplatformed or whatever the kind of flavor of the month of how we talk about what's happening with politicians and with celebrities. I think that's great, but I also think that the ways we think about who's gatekeepers is not quite as clear as what we might have thought, right? I think a decade ago, we would recognize that young people can get on social media and they become viral and everybody is civically engaged. That was something that I subscribed to previously in my work. I actually think now that if the gatekeepers in the past were the network news, the newspapers, right? They were the kind of extra estate that was allowing us to think about these things. I think those watchdogs are now the same platforms and algorithms that Gloria spoke to. It is Facebook, it is Google, it is YouTube, it is Instagram, and they are essentially helping gatekeep TikTok, who gets to engage in these spaces. And so I think there's some real tensions around how we talk about and with whom we talk about the practices of democracy as a result of technology today.
Thank you so much, Antero. And I'm going to move us now to the questions from our audience. And we have some wonderful questions, and I'm going to begin with some of them because I would want you to, and any of you might respond, but the question says, how would Gloria and the panel recommend we help students engage with civil discourse? How do we help them see and listen to the other side in a world that feels fueled by polarization?
Well, let me just start by saying, you know, our young people should have the opportunity to see their democracies up close. And I think once we talk about this, people automatically, their minds head to Washington. That's not what I'm talking about. I literally require my students to go to a local public meeting. Now, most of them would choose the school board. They go to a school board meeting because our offices are literally a block away from the local school district. But in 2010, when Scott Walker became governor, we had a real cause célèbre. With the passage of Act 10, we had 250,000 people converge on our Capitol to protest what he was doing. Several of my students said, you know what, I don't want to go to a school board meeting, I want to go to that. I want to see what people are saying and doing. And I can tell you that I had students who, I won't say were radicalized, they were politicized as a result of engaging in a political protest. And I'll never forget a young woman who had written a reaction piece for me. She was from among immigrant family. And in her reaction, she said, my father has always told me to avoid protests and demonstrations of all kinds because the government can do bad things to you for being there. She said, and I've always avoided them. If I've seen a protest on campus, I've gone the other way. I've never gone to rallies. I've never gone to any of these things. Mm-hmm. What she ended up doing, though, was being convinced by a couple classmates that she should go down to the Capitol. And she has this wonderful line in her reaction paper. She says, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like among American. I felt like an American. And it literally brought a tear to my eye because it was being there in, she has a right to freedom of assembly and to petition her government, two of the things that I pointed out in the talk. And she actually got to do them. So as I said, I tend to be hopeful because I want students to experience democracy up close. I don't want them to worry about what those people are doing in Washington. And maybe I'm jaded because I live in the state capitol and we always got stuff going on. But there's so many public meetings that are attended by 3 people, 6 people. We need our students to get in these meetings and understand how government is actually directly impacting their lives.
Thank you, Gloria. Well, we have some really exciting questions, and I think I'm going to direct this question at Antero, but any one of you could also come in and also talk about it. Gloria, I know you'd want to as well. So what would a democratic classroom look like in today's school?
Thanks, Guadalupe, and whoever asked that question. I think it would look a little different than maybe the models of what we assume the democratic learning looks like in classrooms. So for example, we usually see civics as this thing that happens during one semester when kids are largely checked out because it's in your senior year and you learn about the 3 branches of government. To me, really, I think about the work of Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy in terms of the ways we think about debate. And I would push beyond debate and briefly say that I think, and this kind of goes back to Gloria, what you were saying, I think the ways that we think about what discourse looks like in a democratic classroom might have to start with a simple dialogue, a conversation, and move beyond the concept of debate. I think a lot of harm has happened in English classrooms. I want to own this as a former English teacher. Has happened in English classrooms because we position things as one side needs to win versus another. And it means that we've put kids having to argue around topics like abortion, like their right to be recognized as a citizen in this country, or to be recognized for the gender that they might identify with, right? I think these are important aspects that have caused harm in our classrooms for a long time. And so rather than thinking about discourse as something that's about debate and about winning, what's it mean to center discourse in love and to be understood in terms of solidarity, right? How can I see myself in terms of a democratic classroom where others are affiliating with me and we're able to stand in solidarity with one another as an initial premise, as an initial stance of where we begin. I think this also means we need to not take for granted the languages in which a democratic classroom operates. It also means we need to not take for granted the modalities in which a democratic classroom operates, right? It's not purely text driven, right? I think we can think about the ways oral culture is alive and well in digital spaces as something that we can incorporate into our classrooms right now.
Any other thoughts on this, either Gloria or Tom?
Well, I'll give you an example, and it actually comes from my time at Stanford. I was supervising a student teacher, and I went out to visit the classroom, and it was the US government. And it was a young man in the classroom, one of the students was chewing gum. And the teacher, who was an older white male, said to him, "Hey, you're chewing gum, give me 10. And all of a sudden, this kid has to get down on the floor and he starts doing these push-ups. I was horrified. But you know, I'm an ethnographer, so I sat there and watched the whole thing. Guess what? He had to do that because that class had written its own constitution. And I'm telling you, the laws these kids came up were terrible. And they kept figuring out, you know what, this is not a good idea. I mean, they were gendered. If you were a male chewing gum, you had to do the push-ups. If you were a female, you had to write. They finally figured out that this will never work the way we're doing this. And I'm sure that these kids have, you know, sort of etched in their mind that democracy is really hard. It's not an easy thing to do. And that even when I'm in a room with a lot of young people who are a lot like me, we come up with really stupid solutions to things. So just seeing a classroom in which the teacher in some ways turned everything over to the kids about how to operate was an interesting way exercising democracy.
Absolutely.
And I would make 2 points, if I could, in addition. One is I find too often, even students at Stanford think all the problems of our democracy started this afternoon at 3 o'clock, or started with the 2016 election. Looking at particularly, I find useful case studies of how our democracy grappled with really tough issues from the framing of the Constitution, when Madison said, let's have the federal government, the Congress and the president be able to veto state legislation. There was a bitter debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. It got resolved. How did it get resolved? Through a series of compromises. Over and over again, our democracy has been saved because the underlying values of democracy have been able to survive even in differences and have brought people together. Seeing that happen over the last 2+ centuries is a key part. And the other key part I found is enabling students to not only listen to someone with a view about abortion different than their own, but having to listen enough so that she or he can actually articulate those views as persuasively as possible. It may not change his mind, but it helps to feel a sense of empathy, of togetherness, by seeing these contrasting views come together in a person, and over time come to learn that whether you disagree on a particular one, seeing the importance of the underlying democratic values is the most important.
Thank you, Tom. So we have wonderful questions from the audience still that I want to make sure we get to. So one very, I think a very interesting question for those of us who work with teachers is the following. How do we ensure that the burden of fixing civics education doesn't fall on teachers? How can we make sure that they get the support they need for providing this very important knowledge? And I'll let you choose who wants to respond to it.
Well, I'm probably not the right person, because I would I would in some ways say that teachers have that responsibility. Teachers are not just conduits. They don't just get information and pass it on. That they have to be pedagogically creative. They have to be able to ask really good questions. They have to be willing to challenge students. I did an activity with students once in a college classroom where I asked them to all witness the same thing. We had a videotape of the Rodney King beating, and you will recall that. We just watched the video. And then I gave each of the students an editorial about the beating. So we're not even at the trial, we're not about what happened in CMEDA, just what people thought about the beating. But what I did was I took the name of the publication off and I took the writer off. And I asked the students as they read these to tell me, where does this person sit on the political spectrum? I can tell you they struggle. So one of the things that's very clear to me is that I'm not supposed to make them think a particular way. I'm supposed to help them to think. And so even though students may come in declaring, I'm conservative, I'm liberal, they can't always even articulate what that means. And so that's one of the places that I think we begin, is helping students clarify what they think and believe and why they think that way. Not to dissuade them from thinking that way, but have them be able to defend the way they think.
And I would add that every non-teacher, everyone who's listening to Gloria and the terrific lecture she gave, I do think and hope you will speak out in favor of the kinds of dialogues and exchanges about democratic processes that we're talking. Too many, particularly in public institutions, are scared that politicians will slap them down on the ground that someone in their classroom said something they disagree with. May well be exactly what the teacher hoped for, to have a real dialogue. But too often, I think, as teachers and as administrators, they say, well, the easy road is just to keep quiet, particularly about hot button issues, but also about democratic politics and policies. Keeping quiet will not educate our students. We have to make appropriate noises, and doing that needs the support of the public.
So and other questions, very important questions, and this is one that speaks very much to what we heard in the presentation. Given that we're facing 4 pandemics, how can those of us feeling stifled by the multiple catastrophic states that we are moving forward, we're in by the multiple catastrophes we're in, move forward or begin to repair the harm? So how do we move forward or begin to repair the harm?
I'd say there's a couple of ways that we can begin this work. And to be honest, I think this is going to be hard. I think part of this is recognizing just how much we're losing, how much we've lost, right, in terms of sheer numbers of actual people, in terms of, you know, the time that has gone away as a result of us kind of being necessarily and safely sheltered during this period is important to recognize. But I also think, you know, this is a moment of advocacy. To Tom's point, right, maybe this is like the call to action at the end of like a pledge drive or something. You know, we are seeing kind of nationwide a push against critical race theory, a push against anti-racism in education. And if you are anti-racism, I would encourage you as a former English teacher to think about what that means you're for, right, in terms of the kinds of policies we're thinking about. And so for the several hundreds of you who are watching this presently and maybe in the future, right, what are the ways that you are engaging in local politics to make your voices heard around what civics looks like in terms of moving us forward? The other thing I'd just say is one thing we need to combat is this idea of learning loss. I think this is a big metaphor of how we've been thinking about what's happened academically over the past year. We've been thinking about how kids have lost and the kinds of gaps that have continued to grow. Gloria, you've talked about this as a kind of debt, and I think that's a much better metaphor for us to build with. In some of the work that I've done with other Stanford students, we've been looking at and interviewing families around their experiences during COVID. And there's so much learning and resilience that has come together from communities and family members. And I just want to recognize how much we've gained over the past year as a way to kind of start with a kind of maybe asset-based perspective of how we move forward right now.
And Antero's remarks remind me that, you know, what I've experienced students thinking very, very differently about the way in which they're going through this sort of COVID moment. We hear people say, oh, we're all in this, we're all in the same boat. Well, no, that's not true. We're all in the same storm, but some of us are riding out the storm on a luxury liner. We can work from home, we still get paid, we don't have to worry, we have good health care, we have all these things around. And there are some of us, unfortunately, who are literally holding on to a piece of driftwood, trying to make it through this storm. I had an interesting experience with a class of high school students in Baltimore, where I checked in with them and I asked them how they felt about remote learning. And I had a young man tell me, he says, oh, I absolutely love it. I said, seriously? You love it? I said, well, what do you love about it? He says, well, when they get on my nerves, I just turn them off. And I said, well, what happens? And then he says, oh, in a few minutes, they'll call me on the telephone. And then what I tell them is, I'm having internet connectivity problems. But what he was really saying to me was that for the first time, I'm in total control of my learning. Because when I turn them off in the classroom, when I put that hoodie up over my head and put my head down on the desk, they put me out of the class. But now when I've had enough, I've just had enough. So I think there's some things we've learned in the midst of this about how we should be interacting with students. And I don't imagine anybody who's being smart about it, because I don't think we'll have this moment again, not in our lifetime. I love Rahm Emanuel's statement. I think he ripped it off from Winston Churchill. Never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, trust me, folks, we have a good crisis here. It's huge. And this is our opportunity to stop. And as I say, reset, start again.
Well, and I'm not going to now give us our last question, right? We're going to wind up, but this is a really important question. So how does society develop a value system which values everyone and is valued by everyone? How can we as educators or researchers contribute to such a value system?
I might start by underscoring the good fortune that in this country, it is those values that help start our country. We, the people, had a profound impact on the mindset of how we started. You can ask, and I do frequently, how in the world with that mindset was there slavery? Was there such inequality that existed then? Because those were aspirations, but they were our country's aspirations. And they're aspirations that every one of us has an obligation to live up to. And we as teachers can point to those and say, that's where we've got to go, and help them figure ways to do that. In a lot of other countries, they don't have that. And so that's our opportunity, but we've got to grab the opportunity and move with it as aggressively as we possibly can.
Any other thoughts, Antero or Gloria?
I'll briefly say, I think we've spent, at least within the world of education and schools, we've spent inordinate amounts of time thinking about how we make sure kids feel valued and cared for. And we've spent very, very little time actually asking kids if they feel valued and cared for and asking for their kinds of solutions. I would say let's start with building off of the ingenuity and expertise of young people as maybe one kind of way to get at this question. Guadalupe, I'll just say that I think you've done an amazing job of kind of facilitating us and just knowing your expertise. Not to put you on the spot, but I'd love to hear you thinking about this. I just know you have so much to add to this conversation or just in general. But thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And we've come. I see that Dan is going to be joining us soon to thank everyone. We've reached almost the end of our time. I wish we could talk forever. This is so stimulating. I've had so many things in my head as I listen to all of you, and we'll have a conversation down the hall soon. Antero and Tom and Gloria, I'll wait until I see you at some other point to have that personal conversation. And so I want to thank you for your remarks, for this participation, and I know Dan is going to join us as well.
Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed the meal. Hope, inspiration, despair, spiciness, some nice piquant stories along the way. I thought it was wonderful. And I want to thank you once more, Gloria, for providing your insight and your wisdom and your clarity. It's tremendous clarity. And of course, to our panelists for robust and compelling conversation. So as you log off, you'll be asked to complete a short survey about this presentation. This will help us out so we can continue to connect you with other education thought leaders and ideas. You'll also receive an email in the next week or two with a link to the GSE's YouTube channel and a recording of the presentation. I want to thank you again for joining us. As you take your mints, as you walk out the door, as I kill the metaphor, I hope you continue the conversation with your guests this evening. So thank you all very much. It was a great event. Thank you.